Hey climbers, this is Climb by VSC, a weekly show about building and scaling startups in the world of climate innovation. My name is Vijay Kapoor, general partner of VSC Ventures and co-host of Climb. Every week, I or a member of our VSC team will speak with a pioneer in the climate tech world about emerging technologies and novel ideas that will turn the tide on climate change. We've all heard enough of the doom and gloom. It's time for stories about purpose-driven innovation that lead to sustainable, positive change. In today's episode, we're sharing my conversation with Canary Media columnist and co-host of the Climavores podcast, Michael Grunwald. Having spent over 3 decades with the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Time, and Politico, Michael is an accomplished author of books including The Swamp, The New Deal, and now is working on one about how to feed the world without frying the world. What brought Michael to my attention is this meat tech food tour that he did last year, where he sampled everything from lab-generated cell-based salmon to plant-based fried chicken to several uses for mushroom that you couldn't have even imagined. This is a fascinating world to me, and we needed to learn more about it, so we're going to take a detour from our weekly conversations with VCs and founders to learn more and talk turkey with Michael about alternative meat. If you're hungry, this is a great time to go get a snack. Either way, I'm so happy that you've decided to join us. Now let's climb. Hey climbers, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. Today, I am so excited to have on the show Michael Grunwald, who is a columnist at Canary Media and co-host of the Climavores podcast, which is a show about eating on a changing planet. So Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jay.
Absolutely. Well, we'll talk about your background and sort of what got you into this work in a little bit, but let's start with the adventure that brought you to our attention, which I thought was really cool. You went on a Bay Area foodie tour of sorts last year. Tell us a little bit about that trip and what did you learn from that about the future of food?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm working on a book about how to feed the world without frying the world. And actually, when I first started poking around in this area back in 2019, which was kind of the height of the alt protein euphoria, right? When Beyond had just gone public and Impossible was in Burger King and everybody was like, oh, this is going to take over the world. I had gone to the Bay Area and gone to see a lot of these companies. And now, this was in December. People were starting to complain about how maybe this was just a fad and it's all, going to hell. I thought I should go back and see how things were going. So I went and visited a bunch of these companies. Some, again, got to eat plant-based food, fungi-based food, some cell-based food, cultivated meat, and it was pretty cool. Yeah, so that's where that Twitter thread came from.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit about that. So you mentioned a couple of different things, right? So there's sort of cell-based, and then there is sort of plant-based. Maybe for our listeners who aren't fully up to speed on the differences, because they just see meat alternative as this big category. Right. Maybe educate us a little bit on what the sort of scientific differences are on those two types of things.
I mean, plant-based meat, right? I mean, historically, you always had these like veggie burgers that kind of, looked like hockey pucks and tasted like cardboard.
Morningstar and like those kinds of brands, right?
Yeah. And I guess, Beyond Meat was started in 2009, Impossible Foods in 2011. Those are still the two biggies. And they really had a different theory, which was essentially to fix the kind of problems that I'm focusing on, particularly climate, but also biodiversity, the fact that, more than a third of the world has become an animal farm, that really you're going to have to come up with fake meat that meat eaters like. And the theory is that meat is basically made of, amino acids and lipids and minerals and protein and water, and that plants are made of the same things because meat is basically made of plants. That's what livestock eat. And so the idea is that you could use, extrusion, heat and pressure to basically kind of march these plant molecules into meat formation and really try to replicate meat. And that's what Beyond and Impossible have tried to do. And I do think if you go to, like right now, the Impossible Sausage at Starbucks, I think is really, I mean, even though everybody's down on this sector because Beyond stock went up to 230 and is now down at 13. But I think that sausage is like, that's a great sausage. That's a breakfast sausage. It's still a little more expensive than, a regular one. But, the idea is to get it to taste as good and be as cheap as regular meat. And that's the goal. And so plant-based was sort of the vanguard of this stuff, right? And I think, Beyond has had its struggles. I'm just being honest. I love Ethan Brown, the CEO, but I think Beyond, they're made of pea protein, and I think it just doesn't taste as good yet. I know they're working on it. They're going to try to get the next iteration better. But I do think part of the problem has been a lot of people have tried these plant-based options that have gotten a lot of hype, and they've said, well, it's not as good yet, and that sort of turned them off. It hasn't had the kind of repeat customer stuff that you want. But look, I went to Eclipse Foods, which is a plant-based ice cream place in Berkeley, and it's excellent. It's ice cream. And they're working on an entire dairy platform. So they're, hoping to be able to do milk and cheese. And obviously plant-based milk is already 15% of the milk market in the United States. So it's not like this is, impossible as the, as the phrase goes. It's just not entirely there yet.
What meat alternative stood out to you as maybe a favorite, or was there one that really surprised you in your research and your food tour?
Yeah, I'd say one of the surprising ones. Yes, there's this whole sort of fermentation space, right? Beyond that's you have the plant-based, which is basically just they're really good veggie burgers, much better veggie burgers, scientific biotech veggie burgers. But then you have different types of basically trying to turn cells into protein. And so there are two different types of fermentation. One that's gotten a lot of attention is this idea of kind of precision fermentation, where you genetically engineer yeast to express protein. There's a company called Perfect Day that is trying to make whey proteins. They're in dairy, and they've raised $800 million. They're partners with Archer Daniels Midland. This is a really serious company. And I got to try their cream cheese, and it is cream cheese, right? It tastes exactly the same thing because they are expressing the actual protein. They've, modified this yeast to really make this protein. I think the problem is right now it's still expensive, and scaling up is just going to be insane. Perfect Day told me they're going to make 1,000 tons of whey next year, which is awesome. But the world will eat 1 trillion tons. So we are not there, and it's just a very slow process of scaling up. There's also, I think, some excitement about this. They call it kind of whole biomass fermentation, which is less precise, right, than precision fermentation. And that's basically you put the fungi into the bioreactor, which is basically, it looks like a brewery. And you just let the cells grow. And the fungi turns out to be a really functional protein. And there I visited the Better Meat Company, and they gave me deli turkey slices that were absolutely deli turkey slices. They gave me a chicken breast. It was a lot softer than a chicken breast, but it was good. They also gave me a steak that didn't work at all, but is in sort of early days. But I think that's exciting. And then there's a bigger company called Meaty that's got their mega ranch in Colorado, they call it, which is, of course, just basically a brewery. But they're much bigger, and they're hoping to go national. So I think that's exciting. And then I did get to try some of this cell-based stuff, which, of course, that's just grown. You biopsy a chicken or a cow, and you take the stem cells and you grow it into meat. So, they would say it's not fake meat, it's meat. And that's very exciting. I did get to try Wild Type's sushi, and it was also a little softer, but it tasted like sushi. I went to Just, which is a company that a lot of your listeners might know because they make that a plant-based egg.
I've had it actually. I've had an omelet made with it. It's really interesting.
It's totally good. It's really good.
Yeah.
And They own 99% of the, plant-based egg market. They're doing incredible. They've displaced 400 million eggs. They are, as eggs, have gotten so expensive because of the avian flu, they're actually cost competitive, super great. But because their CEO is a little bit crazy and is on a mission to save the world from factory farming, he's decided he's also going to do cell-based meat. And so they are actually the only company in the world that has the license to sell it. They've been selling it a little bit in Singapore, at a couple of restaurants. And I got to try their chicken breast. And what can I tell you? It tasted like chicken because it was chicken. And that was good. Also, I wouldn't say the texture was exactly right. It was like a little custardy. But they also did me a fried chicken, where the actual chicken part of it was uncanny, really nailed it. They also had the skin, which was not even close. It was like, it was sort of like a chicken flavored potato chip. And they're like, yeah, we're still working on that. But I think it is like this stuff, it's still, when it first was developed in 2013, the first burger was $1.2 million a pound. They're now down to, probably a couple $100 a pound. That is still way too expensive for meat.
Sure. But that is a massive scale improvement, right? As an investor, I'm always looking at, right, when is the cost curve going to intersect with the demand curve? And here, what we're seeing is that cost curve is really coming down very quickly.
Exactly. And I don't want to overstate the extent to which those cost curves are going to cross anytime soon. I think, Upside Foods, which now has FDA approval to sell its cell-based chicken, cultivated chicken, they like to call it. That I think you might start to see product like that, in like a couple restaurants in the next year or two. I tried a pork meatball from Mission Barns, and that's an interesting company because the meatball was like 85% plant-based, but then 15% cell-based animal fat. And their theory is that the fat is kind of part of what makes meat so meaty. And also a lot easier to grow than muscle, right? When you think of it, right? Just think how easy it is for us to grow fat and how hard it is for us to build muscle, right? It's the same thing in a bioreactor. And there I tasted a pork meatball that absolutely nailed it. And they also have bacon that I thought was not even close. But again, I think you will start to see that because on a cost basis, it's going to be a little less exorbitant. They think they're going to be able to compete with organic or other premium meat products. And I think that's exciting. And, again, we'll see how customers react. But this stuff that was originally seen as science fiction, it was exciting to try it, to see that it's real, that there are these real companies with real scientists working to solve these problems. And I think it's unfair to compare it to, it's not kale. It's not that healthy. It's not a whole food. It is processed. But, I always say that what goes on inside a cow is also a process, and it's not like these chickens that are bred to, grow unbelievably top heavy and fat, so that their legs are breaking and, they grow to full size in 6 weeks. I mean, I don't know how natural that is. They're eating GMO grain. So I think I want to give this stuff a chance because again, I'm not the health expert, but on a climate and, environmental, if you do the comparison, this is how you save the planet. Because
and I think if any of our listeners haven't watched the documentary Food Inc., I'm sure you've come across it, Michael, probably came out, I think, a decade ago.
Yeah, I was in the sugar one.
It's eye-opening when you just see the factory farming process for beef, for pork, for chicken. And I think for a little while after, it really made me think twice about what I was ordering. And then again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's what's accessible, right? I mean, the cheapest food right now is a McDonald's $1 or Happy, meal, whatever. And that it's processed chicken and it's quick and it's easy. And it's also in the long term contributing to the massive, unhealthy epidemic of obesity that we're seeing in this country as well. So it's interesting to see those two trends kind of come together, where meat is getting so much easier to make. It's obviously causing a health crisis on one end, and it's causing a climate crisis on the other.
That's right. Well, I think one way for your listeners, particularly thinking of this as an investor, I think one thing that's really interesting, and again, I come at this very much as a, climate dork. That's how I got into this stuff in the first place. Take your hat off to JBS and Smithfield and Tyson. They are unbelievably efficient at what they do, which is essentially, turning feed, into food, right, for us. But the animal is an inherently inefficient way of doing that. Just think about it, right? You've got to, for a chicken, you've got to grow a respiratory system so that it breathes and stays alive. You got to grow feathers and beaks. You've got to make it so that it can cluck and root around. None of that is producing meat. And obviously from a cow, it's very much the same way. Think of all that poop that you're producing. You've got to keep this thing alive for a couple of years instead of just growing the meat. Industrial chickens, which are incredibly efficient, it's probably 9 calories into the chicken to get 1 calorie of meat for us. But, cows are like, probably 40 to 50, 50 calories in to get a calorie out. And that's why we're taking, a third of the world, is to feed cattle, which provide 3% of our calories. And that's basically the problem. I'm going to write a whole book about it. I hope it's going to be a lot more complicated and interesting than that. But if you really want to think of why meat is a problem, and particularly ruminant meat, beef and to a lesser extent lamb and dairy as well, it's because the earth is becoming an animal farm. As we have more human beings, we're going toward, we just hit 8 billion. We're going to hit 9.5 by 2050. As more and more, they get less poor. And the first thing people do when they become less poor is they eat more meat. Either we're going to need 75% more land, and that's basically going to mean the end of the Amazon and the end of the Congo rainforest, or we're going to figure out ways to make our diet less land intensive. And
dependent
that
on
means
meat,
basically less meat.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bad capital efficiency problem, right? As an investor, when you look at 50 calories in for 1 calorie out, or 9 calories in for 1 calorie out, I'm just, from a capital efficiency standpoint, that doesn't make sense. And then you think about the land and all the ancillary issues. Yeah.
Just think of cutting out the middleman, right? And right, exactly. And we're not even talking about things like, this problem with antibiotic resistance, right? There are health studies that predict that's going to kill 10 million people every year by 2050. Get rid of animal agriculture and you're not going to have that problem. You're even seeing concerns about that these, the proximity of people and animal agriculture could cause more pandemics. And, God knows we've seen, what that can do to the economy. So there's definitely a lot of, there's a lot of use case for this stuff. There's a real argument for why we want to do it. But obviously it's not self-executing. And, I know a lot of people in this industry who talk a really good game about how once it tastes as good and gets as cheap as meat, we're going to take over the world. And it's like, that's great. But first it's got to taste as good and get as cheap. For the most part, that hasn't happened yet.
It's interesting that we're sort of talking about the interlink between, consumer choice and then obviously the broader climate impact, right? And I always say consumer choice is also tied to health. I know I've said this on a past episode of the show, but like, for me, as somebody who, tried to get away from red meat, so I moved over more to fish. And then I learned about the whole challenges with microplastics in ocean fish and antibiotics in farm-raised fish. There's really nowhere you're going where you're avoiding, a negative health impact. And then, I guess, talking about price a little bit, like, there's one thing to say that these products are going to be easily accessible in cities, right? You're in Miami, I'm in New York, you're in the Bay Area. These are places that are a little bit more conscious, where you're more likely to see the Impossible Foods sausage sandwich at the local Starbucks. But as you think about the middle of the country, you think about this vast country that we have, most of it being used for meat production, is it realistic to assume that we're going to see customer adoption get to the scale that we need, even just in this country, before we talk about, globally?
Well, I guess the honest answer is I don't know, right? You look at what's happened with electric vehicles, right, which were very much a niche product for a few coastal elites, right, and it seems like just maybe hit a tipping point where they're starting to sell, and certainly in Europe and China, the numbers have just gone like off the charts. Like China, a third of vehicles sold last year were electric. In the US, there was also a big bump. And so, we'll see. I mean, but certainly what we can say about these kind of new technologies is that they won't work if they're not, or at least they won't go mainstream if they're not better and cheaper. Right? That we know. Like there will be some early adopters like Ed Begley Jr., he'll get one. He'll eat whatever vegan product you put in front of him. But for most people, like I'll admit, like, and I'm even a climate dork, but it took me until 2017 to get solar panels in an electric car. Because that's when the cost really, it became, certainly solar sort of became a no-brainer. And the Chevy Bolt was at that point, kind of in the ballpark, and certainly over the life of the car, cheaper, good enough. And I think, for most plant-based and certain meats, we're not there yet. And certainly for the other, the more cellular stuff, it's not even on the market yet. But also just think of how young this industry is, right? I mean, the entire industry is really like, Hampton Creek, which is now they had their first products on the market in, I guess, maybe 2012, their mayonnaise, which they're not even making anymore. The first Impossible Burger was 2016. This is like an incredibly young industry, while like the cow is a pretty mature technology, right? So I think you can expect this stuff to get better. And my assumption has been that as it gets better, more people are going to eat it. And you do see sometimes like Cracker Barrel started offering like a plant-based Impossible sausage like 6 months ago. And it created this whole hubbub with a lot of people who wanted to own the libs saying like, what's happened to Cracker Barrel? You're going woke, and these are Biden burgers. And certainly there's a danger that, in the same way that there was a time when Teslas were seen as Obama cars, right? That's certainly not these days. But I think, there is a danger of this stuff getting caught up in the larger political culture wars. But I do start from the premise that if they get the taste right and they get the cost right, and, to some extent, it's already, I think, as healthy as what it's replacing, even though it is absolutely a processed food. I assume people will eat it, right? I mean, I saw Bloomberg just did a whole story, a cover story, basically saying that this stuff is a fad and it's never going to happen. And the basic argument was that it's processed food, so people don't want it. But I don't know. I feel like Americans kind of like processed food.
Yeah. And especially the different things that we do to it, right? If you're talking about getting sort of raw meat from the grocery store versus getting something at a fast food chain, those two things might as well be different animals. One of the things I'm always curious about in this space, because again, a lot of our listeners are investors. Some of them are founders, always thinking about, where is this investable? Where is the opportunity in this broader alternative meat space? Are the majority of the companies that you're talking to, are they venture funded? Are they joint sort of venture models with the big producers? You mentioned, Tyson is involved as an investor. Purdue is involved as an investor. I'm sure it's the same thing in the beef and the pork industry. What is the capital structure or investment structure of these things look like for investors that are potentially like, hey, I believe this is the future. I want to get involved.
Right. Well, yeah, they basically all started with venture funding. And one thing that was really interesting that I think, and this may help explain, I think, the kind of trough of disillusionment, is that, particularly the big three, that everybody talks about, right? Beyond, Impossible, and what was then Hampton Creek and now Just. They were the first three to raise a ton of venture money. 2011 through 2015, they all raised I think that between the three of them, they had raised like $600 million. And, at the time when there was nothing else out there, it was really just those three. And one thing that was interesting is that they really pitched themselves as tech companies. I've seen Josh Tetrick, the CEO of Just. I've seen his initial pitch deck, and to me, it's kind of hilarious. Like the first slide is basically it's like here's Amazon, a technology company, doing X, and they how they took on Barnes and Noble, books, and then took on toys, and then took on the world. And Hampton Creek is a technology company specializing in food, and we're going to take on mayo, and then cookies, and then every conventional egg. And investors went crazy for it, right? I mean, it was like Khosla was first, and Peter Thiel and Lee Kang, with the richest guy in Asia, whose name is suddenly escaping me, and Mark Benioff, and Richard Branson and Bill Gates and Jack Welch were in Upside. These companies were like, everybody was throwing money at them. And the idea was that they would grow like a tech company. And they were using technology. But they're food companies.
Yeah.
This is what I feel like was forgotten. And this is why when Beyond was suddenly, valued at the same, their valuation was like higher than Tyson's. And it's like, but they've ultimately got to make food. It's not like they're not selling an app. There is a cost of production for each additional unit. It's not like Facebook. And they were being valued like Facebook.
So I can't believe we've gone this far without talking about how you found yourself in this world, because you've written for some amazing publications, Washington Post, Time, Politico, and now you've sort of shifted full time to writing about the clean energy transition and how to feed the world without frying the world. How did this become your beat, Michael?
Well, it's funny. I mean, look, I wrote my first book and came out in 2006. It was an environmental book about Florida, about the Everglades, and got me sort of interested in environmental issues, and kind of moved me to Florida. But I was continuing to cover. I was still at the Washington Post and then at Time Magazine covering politics and policy. And so I got really interested in climate and became really write a lot about clean energy. And in fact, my last book, which was about Obama's first term, has a ton about the kind of how Obama's stimulus had $90 billion for clean energy and really launched the clean energy transition in the United States. It wasn't my full beat, but I wrote a lot about climate. And then I actually got my solar panels. I got my Chevy Bolt. And in, I guess it was 2018, I was writing a magazine story. At that point, I was at Politico, and I was writing about my own life in the new green economy. And I had this throwaway line about how, basically, like I told you, that I did it for the money. I was kind of mercenary, and that, I was still kind of too lazy and selfish to, I don't unplug my computer at night, or I don't like line dry my laundry, and I haven't gone vegan. And then I was like, you know what? I'm been writing about the climate for a decade, and I am not actually sure if going vegan is actually good for the climate. I know everybody says it is, but it's one of those things like the farting cows. I don't know. And so I actually called this one guy I knew, and I was like, is meat really bad for the climate? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay, I didn't know that. And the fact that I didn't know it made me think if I'm not sure, and I actually write about the climate, probably most people don't really know about that stuff. Right. And so as I started looking into it was really when, the Beyond IPO hit, and suddenly people were starting to talk about this food and climate together for the first time. But it's really there are a million books about energy and climate, right? About fossil fuels. And don't get me wrong, that's a really big problem. Food is only 1/3 of the climate problem at this point. But fossil fuels, it's at this point, we kind of get it. Fossil fuels are bad. Like, we need to use less of them.
Yep.
We have eventually used to use none of them. And the way to do that is we need to electrify the economy and kind of convert to zero emissions electricity. It's like, and that's the transition. We know the path. We've started it. The question is how long it's going to take.
Right.
While with food, we don't know shit.
Yeah.
we don't know, like, we hadn't started the path. Nobody was talking about the path. The experts don't agree on the path. So that just struck me as like a much more, interesting. And, while at this point, the energy transition is sort of, it's a like kind of political story about,
Yep.
human will. This is like food and climate and agriculture. This is still a figuring out story. What do we do story? And that, that really excited me.
Yeah. When can we read the book, and what is, I guess, the broader goal? Is it hoping to have legislative change? Is it hoping to get more industry leaders, more dollars flowing in? Or is it just like telling stories that you feel like aren't being told? I mean, what's the goal, and when can we have the books in our hand?
Look, I'm a kind of explanatory journalist, I guess, and I'm a storyteller. And, my idea is always to kind of let the chips fall where they may. But certainly, I think there are a ton of misconceptions in this space. And if you've ever listened to Climavores, we talk about some of them, this idea that kind of like local and organic food is going to save the climate. That's wrong. The idea is that, GMOs are terrible for the climate. Also wrong. So certainly some of this is trying to explain and debunk. But really the first half of the book is going to be about this problem that we've been discussing. And the second half is going to be looking at solutions. And I hope it'll just, it'll be fun to read and be kind of, it will, inspire people to sort of figure this shit out. Because don't believe me, I haven't figured it all out. I'm just, I'm talking to people who are working on it. I do hope that hearing their stories if I finish this frickin' book, but
I didn't mean to add pressure. Like I'm sure your editor is already on you to be like, all right, come on, deadlines, Michael. And I'm sitting here asking the same thing. So that's
I think that ship sailed a couple of years ago. So now I'm like, but
exactly. I guess where I'll close with you, Michael, is like, with all the doom and gloom that's out there, we've talked about how much of the world is being used to feed a small population. Tell me what gives you optimism about the current fight against climate change, whether or not it relates to how we feed the world or even something broader.
Well, look, I mean, I am somewhat optimistic. I think, I would say I've become much more optimistic that these problems are solvable, and maybe a little less optimistic that we're actually going to solve them as a society. I mean, I think look at COVID, right? Which was this like extraordinary technological challenge that we solved like this, right? It was like amazing. Like people with really big brains did some really amazing stuff, and they, and faster than anybody could have imagined, they came up with this miraculous vaccine. And then society just had to kind of, react and act in ways that kind of then solve the problem. And that, it turns out, our big brain species kinds of sucks, right? And so, I've become more optimistic that these awesome technologists are going to basically come up with a climate vaccine, in the form of these, whether it's alternative proteins or alternative, agricultural techniques, et cetera, and maybe, less optimistic that we're going to take it, So, and I worry about that. I'm optimistic, though, about our technological abilities. And I'm optimistic that as finance starts flowing into this, like particularly you look at like carbon markets and, and this stuff is, it's early days and there are all kinds of problems with it. But a lot of people in my world, they love crapping on, carbon credits, right? And what I always say is that it's like the worst solution except for all the others. And
right.
I do think that we're going to see like hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into things that will make the problem less bad, which, A, is an unbelievable opportunity, but B also means like we got to get it right. We kind of know with energy, like we know what to do it, but with land and food, that's not clear yet. And we have not yet figured out a way to use, carbon finance or climate finance to fund the stuff that's just good for the climate and is additional and doesn't leak and is just going to help and, push good solutions and crowd out bad solutions. That I think is the challenge. And I'm more optimistic, honestly, about the kind of financial system and the, technological ecosystem than I am about the political system. Although even you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, even the political system is coming along. So
slowly but surely, right? No, I really appreciate you saying that. And I would echo a lot of what you've said, Michael. I mean, the two biggest takeaways I think that I have from our conversation today. One is, look, the technology can progress as well as they want, but the consumer demand and meeting that consumer demand, which means, better and cheaper, and better could mean how it tastes, how it feels, how healthy it is. And cheaper is, pretty obvious. It needs to get to cost parity. That is paramount, and that's going to be a paramount goal. And look, venture investment and capital can only get you so far, but after a certain point, you have to meet the customer where they're at. And the second thing, which I think you've opened my eyes to, is like how young this industry really is, right? And I just think about the progression that we've had in like solar panels. And 10 years ago, what the cost structure for putting solar panels on your house was, it cost as much as the damn house itself. And now we're talking about, right, a tenth of that cost or a 20th of that cost. And so that actually, I think, is such an interesting perspective to keep in our mind, especially as investors, especially as entrepreneurs, is that if you believe you can make a change in this industry, it's still early days. And that's actually really exciting. Because there's value to be had and there's solutions to be built here. So, Michael, I think we'll close there. This was a fantastic conversation, really enlightening for me. I'm excited for when your book comes out, and we hope to have you back when it does, so we can chat about some of the things that you've learned as you finish putting it together.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed talking. Thanks so much. And
thank you so much, Michael.
Listeners should reach out to me if they have suggestions of stuff I should look at.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to link some of your articles that we mentioned, and we'll link the Climavores podcast so they can dig in with you if they want to learn more about this stuff as well.
Thanks so much.
Well, that's all for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. A few quick shout outs before you go. Our thanks to Michael for sharing this really fun conversation about the evolving world of alternative meats. We look forward to having him back when his book is released. Special thanks to Credo for their help in producing and promoting this episode. To visit any part of today's conversation again, you can find the full transcript on vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Romero for posting those every week. Lastly, and if you've made it this far, please leave us a rating on Spotify or review on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I know, it's still carbon neutral. Well, that's it for now. We'll see you next week on Climb by VSC.